I'd never been one to go through his things, but that day fate seemed to conspire. I got into the car to retrieve a coat I'd left behind, and there, amidst crumpled papers and scattered receipts, a discreet gleam caught my eye. It was a small box, tucked into the corner of the back seat, as if it had been placed in a hurry. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside lay a delicate necklace, with a receipt dated last week. He'd never given me surprise gifts, much less secret ones. In recent years, our birthdays had been celebrated with quick dinners and market flowers, but this necklace was different, expensive, sophisticated, carefully chosen. And yet, he said nothing. The feeling that something was wrong mixed with a nausea that rose in my chest. My heart was pounding so loudly it seemed to echo inside the car. I sat in the driver's seat, still clutching the box, and took a deep breath. Memories of the past few months began to parade through my mind. The nights of endless meetings, the strange smells on the shirts, the messages deleted before I could see them. Everything suddenly seemed to make sense. But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. And the worst was yet to come. When I returned home that night, I put the necklace back in its box and hid it inside my purse. The silence of the car still echoed in my ears. I felt like I had crossed an invisible line between trust and suspicion. I was no longer the same woman who believed every excuse. Now, everything took on a new meaning. The kitchen was lit only by the light from the open refrigerator, where he was rummaging absently. He smiled when he saw me, but it seemed rehearsed, automatic. He asked if I'd been to the grocery store. I just nodded, suppressing the urge to ask, "And the necklace? Whose name is it?" I preferred silence. I remembered how we were in the beginning, the long dinners, the conversations that lasted into the wee hours, the nicknames only we understood. It was easy to believe we'd be together forever. Now I looked at him and saw a stranger, a man who carried secrets in his pockets and in his eyes, and it hurt more than I expected. He'd always been meticulous about his schedule. In the past, I'd admired this discipline, thought it a sign of responsibility. But now, his punctuality had become a code. He'd leave at the same time, come back later, always with excuses on the tip of his tongue. How had I never noticed before? Maybe because I didn't want to see it. That weekend, he'd made up a conference out of town. He said he'd stay 2 days, but he seemed nervous when he spoke. I know him well, every detail of his face, every hesitation, and I saw the fear in his eyes when I asked which hotel he was staying at. He quickly deflected, as if the question were too invasive. I went to his closet that morning. His shirts were hanging, smelling of perfume that wasn't mine. There was a sweet, feminine scent lingering in the fabric. I pressed my nose against it, took a deep breath, and felt anger course through me. This couldn't be just a coincidence. The real world screamed in small details. I started noticing my phone. Before, he'd leave it everywhere, even forget it on the couch. Now, it was like an extension of his hand. He'd go to the bathroom with it, sleep with it next to his pillow. Notifications would flash, and he'd hit the lock button before I could see anything. One night, while he was fast asleep, I tried to pick up his phone. My hands were shaking, but as soon as I touched it, he stirred and held it tightly, even in his sleep. It was instinctive, as if his conscience knew the proof was there. I returned to my side of the bed, feeling the physical and emotional distance growing. I tried to remain calm during the day. At work, I smiled, accomplished my tasks, but my mind was elsewhere. It was like living 2 lives, that of the devoted wife and that of the silent investigator. I knew that at any moment one of those lives would fall apart, and I no longer had control. At dinner with friends, I noticed the cross glances. Some whispered, others quickly looked away. Did they know? Had everyone already noticed before me? The feeling of being the last to find out is one of the cruelest. And I began to realize that perhaps the betrayal was greater than I imagined. In the early hours of the morning, I woke to the sound of notifications. He was in the bathroom, whispering into the phone. I heard soft laughter, a sweet voice on the other end. I closed my eyes and waited for him to return. Feigning sleep was my only weapon at that moment. My chest burned, but I needed more than suspicion. I decided to observe the patterns. He always said he went to the gym 3 times a week, but only came back sweaty on some days. On other days, he smelled the same, as if he'd showered somewhere else. And strangely, he didn't carry a wet towel in his backpack. I wrote everything down silently. On our daughter's birthday, he seemed distracted. While everyone laughed, he stared at his cell phone hidden under the table. I saw the reflection of the screen in his eyes, brighter than any candle on the cake. Anger engulfed me, but I smiled at the family, pretending nothing was wrong. My sister started asking questions. "Do you think he's acting strange?" I smiled and said it was fatigue. But inside, I felt like she'd poked a finger in an open wound. Maybe I wasn't the only one seeing the cracks. Maybe the whole world had. Except me. One morning, he left in a hurry and forgot to pack his coat. When I went to put it away, I found a restaurant receipt in his pocket. It was from an expensive place, for 2 people. On the date, he said he'd worked late. The evidence was small, but sharp. I held the paper until it crumpled. Returning to bed beside him became a theater exercise. I heard his quiet breathing, and inside I felt like screaming. He slept as if nothing were happening, as if the lie were comfortable. And there I was, awake, carrying a weight that kept me awake. I decided I wouldn't confront him yet. I needed more. I needed there to be no escape. Every lie he told was another piece of the puzzle. And I was piecing it all together, piece by piece. The picture that emerged was too ugly to ignore. On Sunday, he said he was going to visit his mother. He got in the car and left early. I waited a few minutes and called his mother-in-law. She answered, surprised, saying she hadn't seen her son in weeks. My body froze. So, where had he gone? I got in my car and decided to drive on. The road seemed endless, and every curve made me more anxious. My heart was pounding so hard my hands nearly slipped off the steering wheel. When I saw him park in front of a discreet hotel, the world spun. I trembled all over. He got out of the car, straightened his shirt, and looked around, as if afraid of being seen. A woman emerged from the entrance and hugged him quickly, complicitly. I stood there, hidden behind the steering wheel, my hands freezing. The scene seemed to tear pieces from my chest. Time stood still. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but at the same time, it was impossible to deny it. They walked in together, laughing softly, unaware that I was there, witnessing it all. The proof was no longer a piece of paper or a smell. It was living flesh before my eyes. I drove home with my mind in turmoil. I opened the necklace again and stared at it. Now I knew who he'd bought it for. It wasn't for me, never had been. The gift was meant to seal what he'd been building behind my back. I spent the night awake, staring at the ceiling. What should I do with this information? Scream, confront, expose, or wait for the right moment, planning like a chess game? I wasn't the same anymore. Something inside me had shattered forever. At breakfast, he came in smiling, feigning normalcy. I set the bread on the table and stared at him. He looked away. The silence between us was deafening. And for the first time, I felt him realize I already knew. I grabbed his phone while he showered. I managed to access a quick message before it froze again. "Yesterday was unforgettable," it said. My body shivered. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, committing that phrase to memory. He came out of the bathroom humming, as if he were a happy man. And, in a way, he was. Happy at my expense, at the expense of the trust he was trampling on. My anger now had a face, a weight, and I could no longer ignore it. During lunch with colleagues, he said he was exhausted. He made up stories about pressure at work, but I already knew it wasn't fatigue. It was too many lies. As he spoke, I stared at his hands, and every gesture felt like cheap theater. The worst wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the fact that he looked at me every day, slept next to me, kissed my forehead as if nothing were wrong. This silent contempt was what tore me apart the most, because it showed he believed he would never be discovered. I closed my eyes that night and swore to myself I wouldn't remain silent forever. His time was running out. With every detail I gathered, with every lie I recorded, I grew stronger. He had no idea what he was about to face. The necklace was still in my bag, kept like a silent weapon. He thought it was just a secret hidden in the car, but to me, it was the key to everything. And when the time was right, that small object would become the definitive proof that would destroy his world. I woke before my alarm that morning. The silence of the house seemed to carry more weight than usual, as if every wall hid secrets I could no longer ignore. I made coffee, set the table, and forced myself to appear calm when he walked into the kitchen, his cell phone glued to his hand. His gaze avoided mine, but his gestures were automatic, as if he wanted to pretend normality. I simply observed, mentally recording every detail. At work, I mentally reviewed everything I'd already collected: receipts, audio recordings, saved notifications, even the strange smells on my clothes. It felt like I was living two parallel lives, one public and smiling, the other hidden and meticulous. I met deadlines, attended meetings, but inside I felt like I was in a private investigation. It wasn't about intuition anymore. It was about facts that added up like solid pieces. This duplicity consumed me, but it also strengthened me. That night, he arrived later than usual. I tried to keep my face calm as I heated the food in the microwave. He made up a meeting that had gone on for too long, but he didn't look me directly in the eye while he spoke. His voice trembled slightly on some words, and that small detail confirmed to me that I was on the right track. A lie has a specific sound, and I learned to recognize it. I swallowed my anger with each bite. I began to notice the way he would turn away when he was on the phone. I used to answer the phone on the couch without a care in the world. Now, I got up and went to my bedroom or the balcony. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to be busy, but I could hear the muffled murmur of laughter and short sentences. It was impossible not to connect the dots. The more he tried to hide it, the clearer the situation became to me. The truth slipped through the cracks. One day, while washing his dress pants, I found a parking receipt in a distant neighborhood in his pocket. It was the same date he said he'd stayed late at the office. My heart raced, but I took a deep breath and put the paper away with the other evidence. Every detail seemed to scream silently, and I no longer needed major discoveries. It was the small traces that gave me the whole map. Over time, even his friends began to notice. One of them commented that he was more distracted, that his mind seemed to be elsewhere. I just smiled and changed the subject, but inside, it gnawed at me. If even those I knew less well already noticed, how could I, sleeping next to him, admit it? The difference was that while they merely suspected, I had real proof hidden away. That was the only thing keeping me going. One random Saturday, I decided to follow him again. I said I was going to the mall with friends, but I parked my car a block away from where he said he'd be in a meeting. The wait was long, each minute felt like an eternity. When I finally saw him leave, he wasn't alone. A woman walked beside him, smiling, and he held her bag as if it were the most natural thing in the world. That scene burned inside me like fire. There were no long hugs or exaggerated gestures. That was precisely what made it all so real. It didn't feel like a movie. It felt like everyday life. They talked as if they were any ordinary couple returning home, and perhaps that was what destroyed me the most. The secret wasn't in grand gestures, but in the simplicity with which he shared his routine with another person. That struck me more than any hidden declaration of love could have. I returned home before him, as if nothing had happened. I set the dinner table, turned on the TV, and tried to distract myself. When he arrived, he brought flowers, as if to mask something. They were cheap, last-minute purchases. He smiled and handed them to me, and I held them tightly, looking straight into his eyes. Inside, my body burned, but outwardly, I remained completely calm. The theater was now reversed, and I was the leading actress. I spent the night awake, replaying everything. The necklace, the messages, the receipts, the parking lot, the scene with the woman. Everything connected, forming an impossible picture to deny. I thought about our daughter, how this would impact her life. I thought about myself, what I deserved and what I was tolerating. And most importantly, I thought about the right moment to expose everything at once. I would no longer allow excuses. On Sunday, he suggested we have lunch. He chose a more elegant restaurant, which was unusual. During the meal, he tried to bring up lighthearted conversation, but I could feel the nervousness in every movement. He drank too much water, avoided prolonged eye contact. It was as if he could already feel the rope tightening, even though I hadn't said anything. His fear was my silent confirmation that he knew he was at his limit. As he spoke, I remembered the nights I'd spent alone, believing he worked for the good of the family. The hours I'd spent making excuses for his absences, believing stories half told. Now every memory was filled with bitterness. It wasn't just about betrayal. It was about the disregard for everything we'd built together. And this realization hurt more than any image. I began to write down not only the facts, but also my feelings. In an old notebook, I wrote down the situations and how I felt about each discovery. It was a way to organize the pain, to prevent anger from blinding me. I realized that with each written page, the woman who accepted crumbs was left behind. What emerged was someone stronger, more aware. And I knew this version of me wouldn't back down. He started trying to be more attentive. Suddenly he remembered details of my day, doing little kindnesses as if he wanted to make up for something. But it no longer worked. To me, every gesture seemed rehearsed, an attempt to distract from what was really happening. The problem is that when trust is lost, even affection feels fake. And I could no longer receive anything from him without suspicion. One cold night, he came over to me in bed and tried to hug me. I remained still, pretending to be almost asleep. He persisted for a few seconds, then gave up. The silence between us was so heavy it seemed to fill the entire room. I knew the physical distance was just a reflection of the emotional distance that could no longer be reversed. And in that moment, I knew something big was about to happen. The next morning, I looked at him over coffee and realized there was no longer any love in my eyes. What existed was analysis, calculation, strategy. I was ready to turn the tables, but I still needed the right moment. I didn't want impulsive outbursts. I wanted something cold, precise, that wouldn't leave room for justification. The wait was cruel, but necessary, and I was willing to endure it until the end. He continued his routine, thinking I was still living in ignorance. Little did he know that his every move was recorded, every lie mapped out. It was like watching an actor repeat lines in a play whose outcome I already knew. And this feeling gave me a strange tranquility. The power had shifted hands, and he had no idea. Little by little, I began to prepare myself emotionally for the confrontation. I tested lines in the mirror, imagined possible scenarios, from the coldest reactions to the most explosive. I needed to be ready for any response from him, because the only thing that couldn't happen was losing myself in the heat of the moment. Calmness would be my greatest weapon, and I could already feel this calm growing within me. That day, I decided to keep the necklace in a strategic place. I didn't want it to be just a bitter memory, but the central piece of the puzzle. It would be the material evidence that would tie all the others together. I looked at him one last time before hiding, and I felt the time was coming to use everything I had collected. The necklace would cease to be just an object and become the symbol of his downfall. As time passed, I realized there was no turning back. He had already crossed all the lines, and I had seen too much to go back. There was no pretending, no rebuilding. All that remained was the reckoning. I was ready to expose, ready to face, ready to turn the page once and for all. The weight of waiting was still heavy, but there was also a strange sense of relief, because deep down I knew the truth could no longer be erased, and this certainty gave me a silent, almost serene strength. I just needed to choose the moment to let go of the rope, and when that moment came, nothing could stop the impact. The week began like so many others, but inside me there was no longer room for normalcy. Every time he said, "I'll go out later," I heard the phrase with different ears. They were no longer just loose words. They were codes that hid meetings, dinners, deleted messages. I responded calmly, as if I believed them, but inside, I counted the minutes. My body seemed to be on constant alert, ready to register any slip-up. At work, I sat in front of the computer and opened the spreadsheet I'd been feeding for weeks. There were dates, times, receipts, calls, screenshots. Everything organized like a process. If anyone saw it, they might think it was an exaggeration, but for me, it was survival. I no longer trusted my memory because emotion distorts. I needed clear, tangible facts to leave no gaps. A colleague commented at lunch that I seemed distant. I smiled and said they were common concerns, but in truth, I was mentally reviewing the last piece of evidence I'd saved. The restaurant receipt, the hidden necklace, the speakerphone call. It was like living in a silent movie inside my own head. And even when I tried to hide it, my eyes no longer hid as much as I'd liked. At home, I noticed every detail of his behavior, the way he avoided leaving his phone face up, the way he responded too quickly to messages when he thought I wasn't looking, the nervousness disguised in smiles that were no longer natural. I recorded everything calmly, but the pain grew each time I confirmed what I already knew. It was like watching someone destroy what we'd built with their own hands. One Saturday, he said he needed to take care of office matters. He left, looking overdressed for a morning of work. He styled his hair more carefully, chose a different perfume. I just watched silently, but I had already decided. I would follow him again. I got in the car a few minutes later and kept my distance. Every kilometer I drove was another preparation for whatever lay ahead. He parked in front of a discreet cafe, in a neighborhood we rarely visited. I waited a few minutes until I saw the same woman approaching. There were no public kisses, no scandalous hugs, just silent complicity, as if it were routine for both of them. That was what destroyed me most. Realizing it wasn't a passing fling, but a second life he'd been keeping hidden. I returned home unseen and kept the information. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just took a deep breath. Silence was already part of my strategy. I needed to think about what to do with it, how to transform each piece into something bigger. It wasn't time for confrontation, not yet. The power lay in remaining calm and accumulating more evidence. That night, when he returned, he pretended he'd spent the day writing endless reports. He talked about numbers, deadlines, as if he'd spent hours in front of the computer. I simply nodded, putting food on his plate, giving no sign of knowing. Inside, every word he said felt like a knife stab. But at the same time, I smiled, certain that his mask was growing increasingly fragile. I started noticing his social media too. Small likes, comments deleted too quickly, discreet tags that disappeared within hours. Nothing explicit, but enough to form a digital trail. I took screenshots and saved them to my secret email. I no longer trusted leaving anything on my phone. Every detail was filed away like gold, knowing it would soon carry weight. The next morning, he forgot to lock his laptop. While making coffee, I quickly opened it and checked his message history. He'd tried to delete them, but some fragments were still there. Short, intimate messages, arranging meetings. I didn't have to read much to feel my stomach churn. I closed the screen before he appeared, but that feeling stayed with me for the rest of the day. That afternoon, I sat in my room and stared at the necklace again. That piece seemed to speak to me as if it were the symbol of everything he was hiding. It wasn't just a gift. It was a lie embodied. I tucked the little box away in the back of a drawer, but I knew it would soon be used. I had no doubt it would be the final piece in dismantling the entire charade. I spoke to a trusted friend without giving too many details. I simply said I thought he was distant, strange. She looked at me and replied, "You already know the answer. You just don't want to admit it." That echoed in my mind for days, because deep down, it was true. I already knew everything. I just needed to accept the weight of what would come next. The following days were a mix of routine and vigilance. I still cooked dinner, still participated in family conversations, still feigned normalcy. But inside, I was at war. His every gesture was scrutinized, his every word weighed. Life went on, but I was no longer part of it as I once was. I was a spectator to a well-crafted lie. I began to think of confrontation strategies. I didn't want to scream or create a scene. I wanted facts, proof on the table, eye to eye. I imagined the scene in my mind, placing the necklace in front of him, showing him receipts, displaying messages. I wanted to see how he would react when there was no way out. This anticipation became my daily fuel. One silent night, I took out my notebook and reread everything I had written down. Dates, times, places. The timeline was clear and irrefutable. It was impossible to deny. I felt a mixture of fear and power. Fear of what this would mean for my life. Power to finally be prepared. The decision was no longer far away. He tried to compensate. He started bringing flowers every now and then, little surprises he hadn't done before, but they no longer worked. To me, every gesture felt like a desperate attempt to balance the scales, and the more he tried, the more evident it became that something was wrong. The truth could no longer be hidden behind petals. One day, when I got out of the shower, I realized he'd left his unlocked phone on the bed. I quickly grabbed it and took photos of their last conversations. They were short but direct sentences. "It was perfect yesterday. I miss you already." I saved everything before he returned. My heart was racing, but the feeling of having it recorded gave me even more strength. That night, I lay next to him, feigning a deep sleep. But deep inside, the decision had already been made. I would no longer live that lie. With every breath he took, I felt I was closer to turning the page. I didn't know what tomorrow would hold, but I knew today was already unbearable, and that was enough to make me act. The next day, I looked at him drinking coffee and felt a cold certainty. There was nothing left to save. What existed between us was no longer love, it was just appearance. I took a deep breath and realized the only thing left was to choose the right moment. And that moment was getting closer and closer. The wait became a daily torture. It was like holding a bomb in my hands, knowing that at some point I would have to release it. But it was also what kept me alive. Knowing that he would soon face his own lies gave me strength. I just needed to wait for the moment when everything would be undeniable. Every time he said, "I love you," I felt a shiver. It wasn't emotion, it was repulsion. The words no longer held weight, they were mere tools of manipulation. He spoke as if repeating a script, and I responded mechanically, knowing that soon I wouldn't have to pretend anymore. At work, I noticed my productivity plummeting. I was exhausted, but I didn't show it. I kept everything silent, afraid to appear vulnerable. But my colleagues commented that I seemed different, more serious, and maybe they were right. I wasn't the same woman anymore. I wouldn't be again. One rainy night, he said he was going to work late again. This time, I didn't follow him. I just stayed home, looking at the clock. I didn't need to see him with my own eyes anymore. I already had enough proof to know where he was. The silence in the house weighed heavily, but it also brought with it the feeling that the end was near. I began to mentally organize how I would proceed, where I would leave the evidence, how I would speak, what I would show first. It was like rehearsing a play, but this one would be real. There would be no applause, just silence. And maybe tears, but not mine. I no longer had any tears to waste on him. Sometimes I thought about simply leaving without saying anything, grabbing my things, leaving a note, disappearing. But then I remembered our daughter and the need to give her answers. It couldn't be an escape. It had to be a settlement. I needed him to look me in the eye when the truth was revealed. The fear was still there, but it no longer dominated me. Now it was just a reminder that I had something big to face. And the power to decide when it would happen gave me a strange calm. I was in control. For the first time in a long time, I was in control. He didn't realize it, but his every gesture pushed me toward the decision. Every half-assed apology, every fake smile, every unjustified absence. It was as if he were digging his own grave without realizing it. And I just watched, saving every detail for the final moment. The necklace remained tucked away in the drawer, waiting for the right moment. Sometimes I would pick it up, look at it, and return it. It was the symbol of the secret, the sum total of everything. And when it was finally revealed, no excuse would resist. I held in my hands the key that would unlock all the doors of truth. And as he slept peacefully beside me, imagining nothing, I knew this day was coming. The weight of the evidence, the weight of the lie, the weight of the silence. Everything was about to explode. And when it did, it wouldn't just be our relationship that would crumble. That morning, I woke with a strange sense of clarity. It was as if everything I'd been piecing together had finally clicked into place, forming a truth impossible to ignore. While he showered, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the drawer where the necklace was kept. The object seemed to pulse, reminding me of every lie he'd ever told. I knew I couldn't push it away any longer. I calmly prepared breakfast, as I always did. I set the table, poured fresh coffee, and cut the bread. He sat across from me, following the same routine as always, checking his phone while he ate. But this time, I couldn't look away. His every move seemed rehearsed, every word measured. It was like watching someone acting a role that no longer convinces. As he talked about work, I thought about how many times I'd believed those stories, how many nights I'd stayed home alone, believing he was devoting himself to his family. The betrayal wasn't just in the secret meetings, but in the way he used our own hopes as a shield. That was what hurt the most. It wasn't just deception, it was disregard for the trust I gave. I got in the car and went to the nearest supermarket. The idea was simple: observe his purchasing patterns. Often when we went out together, I knew exactly what he picked up. But I noticed something new, a different list. More expensive wines, brands we never bought. This confirmed that he had been preparing moments that weren't for me. I returned home with a heavy heart. That night, I decided I wasn't going to sleep. I waited until it went out and slowly got up. I took his cell phone while taking a deep breath, knowing I might get caught. I managed to open the screen for a few seconds before it blocked again, but it was enough to see the notification. A short message. I miss you now. My stomach turned, but the shock turned to coldness. The next day, I tried to maintain a normal routine. We had lunch together, talked to our daughter, and even laughed at a joke on television. But inside, I was distant, planning. His every gesture was observed, every word recorded. It was as if I had become two people, the one who lived everyday life and the one who was preparing for an inevitable reckoning. I also started to notice the times on the card. On the statement, the charges showed a clear frequency. Always the same days of the week, always at similar times. It was impossible not to see the pattern. His routine wasn't just at work, it was also in hidden meetings. That made me even more convinced that I wasn't imagining anything. One day during a family dinner, I noticed how different he behaved in public. He was attentive, he made a point of hugging me in front of others, as if he wanted to prove something. That made me angry. Not because he was trying to deceive me, but because he was trying to manipulate even the views of those around him. It was a complete act, and I knew it wouldn't last long. Sometimes I wondered why I hadn't confronted him yet. The answer was simple. I wanted it to be definitive. I didn't want to give him the chance to deny it, to reverse it, to accuse me of paranoia. I wanted to put all the evidence on the table, at once, with no way out. That thought kept me going, because I knew that when I spoke, it would be the end. One night, I sat in my room and reread the notebook where I wrote everything down. The pages were already worn out from leafing through so much. There was my strength. Every date, every detail, every test was a reminder that I wasn't crazy, that my intuition was always right. I closed the notebook and felt a calm that I hadn't felt in a long time. I decided to observe how he reacted to small provocations. I asked banal questions like, "Where were you again yesterday?" Or, "Who called you just now?" The answers came quickly, but the look betrayed nervousness. Sweaty hands, rapid breathing. I didn't need to hear confessions. I already had the answers in his body. At the office, while he said he was swamped with work, I received messages from friends who were going through similar situations. Some told stories of betrayals discovered by chance. Others spoke of the pain of being suspicious and having no proof. I realized that my story was no exception. It was more common than you might think. And that gave me even more strength to not accept the silence. I looked at our daughter differently again. I thought about what I was teaching her by enduring everything in silence. I didn't want her to grow up thinking it was normal to cancel herself out to maintain a facade. I wanted her to see strength in me, to understand that confidence is something non-negotiable. This changed everything inside me. One Friday night, he said he was going to the market. I took the car and followed. I watched as he parked in front of a pharmacy and stayed in the car for almost 20 minutes, texting. Then he went in quickly, just bought a bottle of water, and came back. It was obvious that the market was just an excuse. I returned home without being seen, but with one more piece of evidence stored in my memory. That night, I placed the necklace on the table in his room while he took a shower. I wanted to see the reaction. When he came out, he stared at the object, surprised, but tried to hide it. He asked where I had gotten it from, as if he didn't know. I just said I found it in the car. He stuttered, but didn't respond. That reaction was all I needed. From that day on, he became more restless. I used my cell phone more frequently and avoided leaving objects lying around. It was as if he noticed that I was more attentive. But that only further confirmed that there was something to hide. And his every attitude became more predictable. Fear was already starting to work against him. One morning, I decided to call the restaurant from the receipt I found. The attendant confirmed the reservation on his behalf, for 2 people, on a date he had said was a meeting. Her voice was neutral, but to me it was like a punch. I hung up the phone with shaking hands, but with an even firmer heart. Now I had the confirmation I was missing. While he thought I was distracted, I was already planning my next move. I wanted the impact to be calculated, with no room for maneuver. It was no longer a question of if, but when. And this feeling of proximity to the end gave me a strange serenity, because I knew that soon, the whole truth would come out. He started to notice that I didn't react like I used to. I didn't ask so much, I didn't argue, and that made him even more anxious. But the silence was on purpose. I didn't want to argue without proof. I didn't want to fight without certainty. I wanted the perfect moment to expose everything so that he couldn't defend himself. That week we slept in silence almost every night. The room seemed like a silent battlefield, everyone facing their own side. There was no more affection. There were no more real words. Just two bodies sharing the same space, pretending nothing was happening. And I knew that this theater wouldn't last long. I started dreaming about the confrontation. I imagined the scene in detail. The evidence spread out on the table, the necklace in front of him, the receipts and messages in my hands. I would say little, let the facts speak for me. He would have no way out. This image replayed in my mind like a movie, until it became inevitable. At work, I noticed that I was colder. Colleagues called me to talk, but I felt distant, disconnected. It was as if all my energy was being sucked out of keeping that secret at home. I wasn't the same anymore, and everyone could see that. The difference is that only I knew the reason. One Sunday, he suggested we go out as a family. We went to a park, took photos, laughed with our daughter. To anyone looking from the outside, we were a happy family. But I knew that happiness was just a facade. As he smiled for the photos, I only thought about how everything would fall apart when the truth was exposed. One rainy afternoon, I sat alone in the living room and stared at the notebook once again. The notes, the tests, everything was there. I realized there was nothing left to add. The investigation was complete. Now it was just a matter of courage. And for the first time, I felt like I was ready. He arrived late that night, claiming yet another meeting. I stared at him when he walked in, and for a moment I thought he realized something was about to change. The silence between us was so strong it could have been broken, and at that moment, I knew that the decision had already been made within me. I spent the night awake, with my heart racing. I thought about what the impact would be like, how I would react when there was no way out. He didn't want theatrical revenge, he just wanted the naked truth placed in front of him. And once that happened, there would be no turning back. Nothing would be the same again. The next morning, I looked at him and realized that this man was no longer my partner. He was just someone who shared the house with me, full of secrets and lies. And I knew I was about to rip off all the masks. The time for waiting was over. I didn't know what his reaction would be, but I knew it didn't matter. Because now I had all the evidence I needed in my hands. And when everything came to light, he would have nowhere left to hide. The impact would be inevitable, and I was already prepared to face every second. And while he left for another normal day, I sat alone, took a deep breath, and organized the papers on the table. It was like preparing a silent battlefield, and I knew that when he came back, nothing would be the same. That Monday morning, I woke up before him and stared at the ceiling. The noise of the shower echoed in the bathroom, and I knew that when I came out, I would come back with the same excuses as always. I took out my notebook and opened it to the most recent page. Everything was there: the receipts, the schedules, the audios, the photos. It was like an inventory of the double life he was hiding from me. As we drank coffee, I noticed his tired eyes. He covered it with a quick smile, but the expression of someone carrying secrets doesn't go unnoticed. I didn't ask anything. I just put the coffee on the table and watched the way he used his cell phone every 5 minutes. This addiction to looking at the screen delivered much more than he imagined. At work, I tried to focus on my tasks, but my head was at home. I remembered the night before, when he invented a business dinner. I no longer needed to follow him to know the truth. The silence, the different smells, the messages that flashed on the cell phone screen were enough. It was as if he left crumbs on purpose, thinking I would never have the courage to put it all together. On the way home, I parked the car and spent a few minutes in it. I took the necklace out of my bag and stared at the jewelry. It was beautiful, expensive, chosen with care. But not for me. It was a physical reminder that someone, somewhere, was receiving what I was no longer receiving. The weight of that object was greater than the gold it was made of. I walked into the house and found our daughter on the couch, laughing at a show on TV. I sat next to her and tried to smile, but my mind was elsewhere. I thought about how this would all affect her life when it came to light. It wasn't just about me, it was about the three of us. And this responsibility made the decision weigh even more. That night, while he was fast asleep, I got up and went to the guest room. I opened the notebook and started organizing all the tests into separate folders. Audios in one, receipts in another, prints in a third. I gave neutral names to the files so as not to arouse suspicion. That organization gave me a feeling of power that I hadn't felt in a long time. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done before. I called the lawyer again and scheduled a face-to-face conversation. I told myself it was just for information, but deep down, I knew I was already laying the groundwork. The lawyer was direct. He asked for documents, extracts, records. Everything I had already been putting together. And I realized that I was ready for any scenario. In the afternoon, he called me saying he would be home later again. The excuse was an emergency meeting. I just replied, "Okay," and hung up. He didn't realize that the coldness in my voice wasn't tiredness. It was conviction. I no longer argued. I didn't demand. I didn't beg. Silence was now my most powerful weapon. At the next dinner, I noticed his effort to appear present. He talked about projects, about possible trips. He even asked about my plans. But everything sounded rehearsed, like someone trying to distract from the truth. I responded in short sentences without elaborating. The discomfort grew, and he began to realize that something was different. One afternoon, while cleaning the laundry room, I found another detail. A women's scarf inside his backpack. It wasn't mine. It never had been. I kept it in a box with the necklace as part of the growing silent dossier. I didn't get any satisfaction. I just photographed it, cataloged it, and returned it to the hiding place. My patience was no longer passivity. It was strategy. Days later, he received a call in his car and forgot to turn off the speakerphone. I heard a female voice laughing and asking, "When will I see you again?" He hung up quickly, but it was too late. He pretended nothing happened, changed the subject, and turned up the volume on the radio. I just smiled, as if I hadn't noticed. Inside, my heart was pounding. At work, a colleague commented on a recent company dinner. I asked about details, and she unknowingly confirmed that he wasn't there. Another lie unmasked, this time without me having to try. It was as if everything around started to collaborate to reveal the truth. Even those who didn't know ended up being involuntary witnesses. At home, he continued to act. He brought flowers, paid compliments, offered help, but everything seemed heavy, false, distant. I received it in silence, knowing that each gesture was just another attempt to hide. The more he tried to appear dedicated, the more certain I became that the confrontation needed to happen soon. One rainy night, I sat in the living room alone and thought about what the impact would be. I imagined the necklace on the table, the evidence in my hands, his silence in the face of the truth. There would be no room for excuses. There would be no way to reverse it. For the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. And this feeling gave me a frightening tranquility. The next morning, I decided to test it. I casually asked about the hotel where I would have stayed on a trip. He stuttered. He didn't remember the name. He invented something on the spot. I just smiled as if I believed it. But inside, I realized how much he was no longer able to support his own stories. His fear was written all over his face. I started to notice how he looked at me differently. Before, it was with confidence. Now, it was with suspicion. He already realized that something was not normal, but I didn't know what exactly. And that made him insecure. It was visible in his gestures, in the way he spoke, even in the way he sat at the table. He already felt the ground opening up. At the weekend, he suggested we go out for dinner. I accepted, but I was silent most of the time. He talked, and I just watched. My staring seemed to bother him, and he constantly tried to change the subject. When we returned home, I realized that I was getting closer and closer to the explosion. One Monday, I received an anonymous message on my cell phone, just one photo, him entering a hotel with the same woman I had seen before. My stomach dropped, but at the same time, I felt a wave of relief. It wasn't just me who knew now. Someone else had seen it and recorded it. The lie was slipping out of his control. I came home and found him on the couch, watching TV as if nothing had happened. I sat down and remained silent. He tried to make conversation, but my mind was focused on organizing the final strategy. I already had everything I needed. The next step would be no more observation. It would be action. At night, I opened the drawer and took the necklace out of the box. I placed it on the living room table and looked at it for a few minutes. This was no longer just a jewel. It was a symbol, a summary of the entire lie. I felt a strange calm as I realized that soon he would be facing his own trap. The next day, he woke up early and seemed restless. He walked around the house as if looking for something. as if he had lost control. Watching him like that made me sure the mask was slipping. He didn't realize it, but he couldn't hide it anymore. It was just a matter of time. I spent the afternoon in silence, thinking about what the right time would be. I didn't want screams. I didn't want an audience. I just wanted facts and eye to eye. Dignity is not in those who shout the loudest, but in those who explain clearly. And that's exactly what I intended to do. When he got home that night, I watched him in silence. He tried to hug me, he tried to talk, but I didn't respond. I just sat and stared at him. It was the first moment I saw real fear in his eyes. It was no longer the fear of being discovered. It was the fear of realizing that I already knew. I spent the morning awake, reviewing every detail. I thought about how he would react, denying, crying, trying to reverse it. But I also thought about how I would react. And I realized that it no longer mattered. Because now I had all the cards in my hands. And he just lies. The next morning he left in a hurry, saying he had important commitments. I just watched without responding. I waited for the door to close and sat down again in front of the necklace. The time was coming. I could feel it. And nothing, absolutely nothing, could stop it. As I set the dinner table, I thought about how life can change in a matter of minutes. Everything that seemed solid can collapse with one detail. And at that moment, I knew I was about to turn the page. The lie had an expiration date, and he was about to find out the hard way. When he entered the house and saw the necklace on the table, he froze. His silence said more than any words. I just crossed my arms and waited for the reaction. He tried to hide it, asking where I got it from. The voice broke. The eyes looked away. I answered firmly, "From your car." There was no more denying it. That night, we slept in separate rooms. He pretended to be sleepy, but his breathing betrayed his nervousness. I, for the first time in weeks, slept peacefully. The next day, he came full of kindness. Coffee ready, forced compliments, rehearsed gestures. Everything sounded false, heavy, almost desperate. Every time he picked up his cell phone, he ran to another room. The low voice, the quick messages, the restless look. Fear had already taken over him. At family lunch, I tried to laugh out loud, to appear relaxed. But he avoided looking at me. My sister noticed the mood and gave me a silent look of complicity. When I finally managed to see the cell phone, there it was. It was wonderful yesterday. I already miss it. I took photos in seconds. Definitive proof, simple and impossible to deny. He tried to get closer that night, to talk about starting over. I just said, "Don't touch me." The phrase cut through the air like a sentence. In the following days, he remained silent, withdrawn, insecure. Our daughter began to notice the silence at home. The lie was no longer just between the two of us. It affected everyone. And I knew. That was just the beginning of the end. The necklace, the receipts, the messages. Everything was ready to bring down not only the marriage, but also his image outside the home. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the open folder. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. Every test before him was a silent punch. The excuses came stumbling. "It's not what you think." But I didn't react. I just said firmly, "Explain it to yourself, not to me." He cried, but not with regret. He cried for fear of losing everything he had built. I saw clearly that it wasn't out of love. I went down to the living room and left him alone with his papers. Silence was the worst punishment. He drowned in his own lies. That night, he slept on the couch. I locked the bedroom door and felt the weight of physical distance. There was no longer marriage, just coexistence. At breakfast, he tried to start a conversation. I just said, "Not today." The firmness of my voice silenced any attempt at dialogue. In the following days, long messages came asking for forgiveness. I read them all, but I didn't respond. He didn't understand that words no longer had value. Even our daughter noticed the difference. He asked why he was strange. His silence was the most honest response in months. I started organizing my own things, bills, documents. It was my way of showing, without saying anything, that there was no going back. And as I sat alone that night, I realized there was no more anger, only clarity. His fall had already begun, and nothing could stop it. I woke up determined not to hide anything from myself anymore. The folder was organized, each test in its place. It felt like it weighed tons in my hands. At breakfast, he talked about banal things. I just listened, without giving space for conversations. Silence was my shield. As I worked, I realized I was no longer afraid. Anxiety had turned into strength. I controlled the situation. In the afternoon, I received another message from him saying he would be late. I just replied, "Okay." He didn't notice the coldness behind that word. I sat on the couch with our daughter and we watched a movie. Her laughter gave me strength. I knew I was doing it for her too. When he arrived, he brought flowers and chocolates. I pulled away from the kiss and remained silent. He kept everything without insisting. In the early hours of the morning, I went downstairs and found him on the couch with his cell phone. I asked, "Is it still worth lying?" He couldn't respond. In the following days, tension grew. He seemed to live on alert, watching my every move. Fear already dominated him. I spoke to his mother on the phone. I didn't go into details, but she understood. He just said, "I trust you will do the right thing." One night, I threw the question into the air. "Do you want to talk about work or the hotel?" He swallowed hard and remained silent. I noticed that even friends were distancing themselves. Crossed glances, cold greetings. The truth began to circulate without me having to say anything. At home, every meal was heavy. Silence was always present. It was no longer a home, it was a battlefield. I started visualizing my life alone. No luxury, just peace. And peace was all I needed. I started organizing my finances in secret, opening accounts, separating documents. Every detail was a step towards freedom. And as I sat alone looking at the folder, I understood. It wasn't just about us. It was about his fall in front of everyone who believed in his perfect image. That morning, when I sat down in front of him with the table set, there were no longer any disguises. I looked at him calmly and said, "Today we're going to talk for real." He swallowed hard, left the cup on the table, and looked down. His expression was that of someone who knew exactly what was coming. There was no longer any way to escape. I took the folder and placed it on the table. I opened it slowly, showing receipts, prints, photos, one by one, like pieces of a puzzle. He tried to justify himself, but I raised my hand, asking for silence. "You're not going to convince me of anything. I'm not here to hear excuses. I'm here to bring closure to a story that you yourself destroyed." The silence that followed was deafening. He looked at the papers, pale, breathing quickly. I tried to find a way out, but there was none. Every document, every detail, every record was undeniable. I didn't need to scream. The truth screamed by itself. The weight was all on his shoulders. He tried to use his daughter as an argument. He said that we should think about her, that we could start over with her. But I stopped him. It's precisely because of her that I'm not going to continue living a lie. I'm not going to teach my daughter that it's normal to accept betrayal and pretend that nothing happened. He lowered his head without response. That sentence was like a final blow. He knew there was no way to fight back. Fear was on his face, not of losing me, but of losing the image of the exemplary father he always showed. And that destroyed him more than any word of mine. It was the first time that he no longer had power over the narrative. I got up from the table and started collecting the evidence. He said calmly, "You destroyed something that won't come back. Now I'm going to rebuild my life." He tried to get closer, but I backed away. "Don't touch me. I'm not your wife anymore. I'm just the woman who survived your lies." That sentence hung in the air like a final sentence. I spent the day in silence, but inside I felt a different strength. It was no longer pain. It was release. I realized I was crossing a point of no return. And as hard as it was, there was relief in knowing that I didn't have to carry that anymore. It was like breathing after weeks of suffocation. At night, our daughter came into the room and asked if everything was okay. I smiled and said, "Everything is falling into place." She didn't need details right now, but one day, when she was older, she would understand that her mother did not accept being deceived, and I was sure she would be proud of it. In the following days, I began to notice external reactions. Mutual friends began to move away from him. Some looks changed. Gossip was already circulating. The evidence I had didn't just stay with me. Silently, they spread. And the impact began to reach not only our home, but also his social life. At work, he began to suffer the consequences. Small comments, declined invitations, tense meetings. Little by little, his image as a dedicated professional began to crumble. And that was something that I didn't have to lift a finger for to happen. The truth has strength of its own. She always finds her way to appear. Meanwhile, I grew stronger. I sought therapy, went out with friends again, took up hobbies I had abandoned. I discovered within myself a version that I didn't know myself. Firmer, clearer, more self-possessed. The betrayal had hurt me, but it had also shown me that I was capable of much more than I imagined. He, on the other hand, wallowed in attempts to control the uncontrollable. I called, sent messages, tried to talk, but I no longer responded in the same way. It wasn't coldness, it was protection. I knew that any word of mine could be used for manipulation, so I chose silence. And that silence was my greatest weapon. One night, I sat on the couch and thought about everything. I thought about the promises made, the oaths of fidelity, the sleepless nights believing the excuses. It was like watching a movie again, only now I understood each scene clearly, and I realized that, deep down, I always knew. Intuition never fails. What fails is the courage to accept the truth. I then decided that I wouldn't keep anything else. I wouldn't hold a grudge, just learning. Because the pain had already fulfilled its role. She had transformed me, and this transformation was my silent victory. Not about him, but about myself. Time passed, and I realized that I no longer cried. I no longer felt that lump in my throat. There was room for new plans, new possibilities, and it brought me a peace that I hadn't felt in years. I didn't just survive betrayal, I broke free from it. But there was still something pending. Something that needed to be said not only to me, but to all women who have experienced the same thing. Because I knew my story was not unique. How many have already become suspicious? How many have already found clues? How many have already been silenced by excuses and fear? This reflection consumed me. I thought about how many continue to ignore signs to preserve an illusion. How many close their eyes to maintain the facade of a perfect marriage? And I realized that silence feeds the cycle. The courage to face the truth is what breaks chains. I had broken mine. I looked in the mirror and saw a different woman. Not the injured wife, not the victim, but someone who walked through the fire and came out in one piece. The marks were there, but they were marks of resistance. And no one could take that away from me. I finally recognized myself again. He kept trying to get back on his feet, but he was no longer part of my life. Each attempt at contact was met with the same silence, and that destroyed him more than any fight. Because he could no longer manipulate, he could no longer reverse. The game was over. Over time, I noticed that even the anger disappeared. All that remained was indifference, and indifference is the greatest proof of overcoming. It wasn't about wanting revenge, it was about not wanting anything else. This was the most unexpected victory of all. I sat down to write everything, in the form of a report, like now. Not to relive the pain, but to transform it into learning. Because every line written was a way of saying to myself, I won, I crossed, and I'm here, stronger than before. I closed the notebook, took a deep breath, and looked around. The house no longer felt suffocating. It was just a space in transition. I knew that a new stage would soon come, and I was ready for it. Because there were no more lies to hold me back. I got up, went to the balcony, and looked at the sky. The night was silent, but inside me there was a cry for freedom. I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. I no longer needed to hide. I no longer needed to pretend. The truth was already alive, and I was finally at peace. And then, I asked myself silently, how many women will still close their eyes to such clear signs? How many will still accept living in silence while the truth screams inside? This question kept echoing in my mind, and I know that it also resonates with those who listen to my story. Because deep down, it's not just about me, it's about everyone. So I ask you, what if it were you? What would you do in the face of the tests? Would you keep it silent, trying to protect yourself? Or would you have the courage to expose and free yourself? Because the truth is harsh, but lies kill you inside. And one time or another, everything comes to a head. It always comes.